Every time you get in combat in D&D, you shouldn't swing your sword at the dungeon master. Perception, insight, investigation. If you play 5th edition, you're familiar with these words. You roll to see if you see something. You roll to see if someone is lying to you. You roll to see what you can find in the room. But in the grand span history of Dungeons and Dragons, that's actually kind of a relatively new concept. It used to rely a lot more on player skill versus character skill. These are two different things, and they both point to what is driving the action in the game. So if we take one situation, say there's treasure hidden in a room, and we use player skill to find it, that would involve a player saying things such as, okay, I'm gonna check under the rug. What's behind this curtain? Is there anything on the table that I didn't notice before? Oh, I'm going to open the jars and dig in those. Whereas character skill would be I roll investigation. And there's not a right or a wrong there. I like to lean a little more toward player skill in those instances, but player skill is not great across the board. If you take that scenario I mentioned in the beginning of the game, if a combat encounter starts, don't stab your dungeon master. Pretty good advice, right? And so in that instance, character skill is abstracted to deal with the combat encounter. You roll dice. You rely on stats. The player themselves don't have to know anything about how to swing a sword or martial arts or how to wear armor or anything such as that. And I don't think there's many of us outside of some LARPing communities that want to change that. So most actions in an RPG lay somewhere between those two poles. If you were searching said room, you could give the examples of where you want to look. If you're swinging a sword, you roll a dice. And this ties a little bit into metagaming. So this all came up for me recently when I read a post about someone who was playing a game and it was 5th edition and their character was listening to an NPC, and so they rolled insight to see if they thought the NPC was lying. So here's the rub. The player was almost certain that the NPC was lying, but their character failed the check. So the dungeon master told them that their character thought that this person was telling the truth, and then got annoyed when the player started metagaming. Now, I know metagaming has kind of gotten a bad rap from a lot of people, but I think it has its time and place, especially in a game that relies more on player skill. If that game was relying more on player skill, it could have ignored the check altogether. That check would have never happened. It would have been as simple as the player thinking, okay, I have reason to doubt this person, and I am going to act accordingly. Even if their character didn't have a magic number that aligned to having them do exactly that. So the options are to either metagame, your character failed a check, but you know this character is probably lying, so you play accordingly. Ignore that result and feel kind of frustrated. Or if you are one of those people that enjoys complete actor stance role playing, i.e., you are going to completely inhabit the role player. And then we're talking about the role play versus game spectrum, and you're going heavily toward role play in that case. You can also do that. And I would like to suggest another way to avoid this, and that is secret roles. This isn't a new concept, but it is something that Pathfinder 2e does quite well. Some roles are made by the game master without the player knowing the results. And those are things such as insight, investigation, even stealth. Your character is going to try and hide, and they don't know that they've been spotted until it's too late. So all of this really depends on what you and your table decides is right for you. I think one of the benefits of the player skill in this instance versus the character skill is that it creates more tension in the game and becomes more interesting for the player. If the character failed the roll and it was explained to the player as you're pretty sure he's telling the truth, that's a cue to the player that the exact opposite is true. So that lie, psychologically for the player, the person actually playing and enjoying the game, is now kind of blown out of the water. That tension is gone. They're not waiting to see, is he lying or not? They're waiting for the lie to come to fruition, perhaps bitterly. Whereas the result of the check could also be phrased as, there's something about the NPC's demeanor you can't quite place. You're having a hard time to tell if they're telling the truth or not. And if you're going to rely on character skill, that's a much better route to go because it at least preserves some of that tension. But going complete player skill, the player gets to act on what they heard, and that tension is still there because they could be wrong and they don't know until they do. So they have to make an interesting decision. And if we know anything about me and RPGs, I'm all about the players making interesting decisions. I'm also all about the DM making interesting decisions, but that's another story. So if you find yourself coming up against these things during your games, that's okay, but it's worth talking to your table about. What do they prefer? Do they prefer one for one type of thing and one for the other? Tables that are low on the role-playing side of things, for instance, a player who might say, I want to try and convince the king to send out the army, but does not want to role-play that conversation, might like character skill a lot more. Because in a sense, they get to say what they want to do, simply push a button, i.e. roll the dice, and see if it works or not. But people who like to role-play out the scene and give very convincing arguments and things like that might want to go more with player skill. Did the DM think that argument was substantial enough for the NPC? Don't roll a die. The king does what the king was asked. And again, this is largely why dungeon masters were created, to abdicate things that the rules could not. And in games that lean more toward character skill than player skill, it actually minimizes the role of the game master in that capacity. They're more there now to move monsters around the map. And we could talk about Blackmore and things like that, but I think you probably get the point. I would love to hear from you on this, because I imagine it must have sparked some thoughts with some people. Go to crumblingkeep.com/question. crumblingkeep.com/question. You'll find the link in the show notes. And leave me a little message about what you think. If I think it's really cool, I'll include it in a future episode. So yeah, get your thoughts out there. I hope you're all having a great week. Now I'm going to metagame player skill myself out of here.